Hello, you're right, and welcome to this week's recorded lesson for history. Today we're going to be looking at Dunkirk, and we're going to be looking at whether we think that the events at Dunkirk were a triumph or a disaster. Okay, so could we all write the date, whatever date it is that you are doing this, and the title, which is Dunkirk, triumph or disaster. We're going to be able to describe the events of Dunkirk by the end of the lesson, and also assess whether we think it can be seen as a triumph or a disaster. Okay, so write down the date and title. Feel free to put the learning outcomes if you'd like to as well. And then we'll move on. Right, guys, before we move into trying to form a debate and come to a conclusion of whether we think it was a triumph or a disaster, we actually have to look at what happened, what took place, and the events of Dunkirk itself. Okay, so over the next few slides, I'll read through some of the events, and if you just listen in and get familiar with what happened at Dunkirk and why it happened. Okay, as the Germans advanced into northern France, they took the British and French troops by surprise. Now, we looked at this in last lessons, or the Western Front lesson last week, so that won't be a surprise to you. The British and some of the French army were pushed back to the beaches of Dunkirk. The troops were trapped between the German troops and the English Channel. There was a real danger that the entire British army of over 300,000 men would be wiped out before the war had really gone underway. Okay, so the English and some of the French had been pushed right back to the Channel by the German soldiers, and they were trapped on the beach. Okay. All 300,000 of them could be captured or killed if something is not done, okay, which would be a disaster to Britain's war effort and damage their chances of winning the war later down the line. On the 27th of May 1940, the British government, led by Winston Churchill, put a plan together called Operation Dynamo into action. The aim was to evacuate the troops to Britain by ship. So evacuate means to save them, to get them out of France and to bring them back to the safety of Britain, okay? As well as ships from the army, all sorts of craft, including pleasure steamers and fishing boats, were used. Most of the soldiers were rescued. However, the British had left behind valuable military equipment for the Germans to use. Okay, so it wasn't just military ships and navy people that brought back those British soldiers. Many regular people took their boats over, whether they were fishing boats or whatever, went over the Channel themselves and tried to load as many British soldiers onto their ship as they could and brought them back to Britain. However, a lot of military equipment, such as weapons and machinery, had been left that the Germans could use and fight against the British with it in the future. After the evacuation took place, news of the evacuation itself was carefully controlled because the government wanted to keep the British people's spirits high at the beginning of the war. This affects much of the information that we get on the event today, as we'll see later in this lesson. Okay, so after the evacuation, a lot of people in the government wanted to stop the media from maybe telling the complete truth about the events. They wanted to show that it had been a success and that it was a triumph. Okay, so as you can see here on the paper, it shows that Dunkirk defence defies 300,000. It shows that 4/5 of the navy have been saved. Okay, it shows the event in a good light and that it was positive. Okay, they wanted to do this because it was important to keep British people happy, keep their spirits high, so they had the energy to continue to fight a war over the next few years. Right, guys, moving on to the main task of today's lesson on Dunkirk. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to copy out this table, okay? It's going to have 3 columns. The first one with the source number. The second one, what can I learn or infer about Dunkirk? So what can you find out about Dunkirk from that specific source? And then finally, does this source suggest triumph or disaster? Now, over the next couple of slides, I'm going to be showing you various sources or bits of information from Dunkirk at the time. You have to take out the information or what you can learn about Dunkirk from that source, and then you have to decide whether you think it shows Dunkirk is a triumph or a disaster. Okay, so take out the good information you can use, things you can learn about Dunkirk, put it in that column, and then put whether you think that shows Dunkirk as a triumph or a disaster in the next column. So some of them are going to show Dunkirk as being a really positive thing, whereas others might say it wasn't as great and suggested it was a bit more or closer to a disaster. So you've got to decide which one those are and put them in the right column. Right, guys, on this slide we have sources 1 to 4. I'll read through each source with you. Then you have to take out the information and put it in your table. Okay, so what can you learn about Dunkirk from each source? And does each source show Dunkirk as a triumph or a disaster? Okay, so source number 1, which is a first-hand account by a soldier published in 1940. That said, he said, stepping over the bodies, we marched onto the beach. It stank of blood. It was like walking through a slaughterhouse on a hot day. So that's source number 1. Source 2, first-hand account by a gunner officer, published in 1940. There were lines of men waiting in queues until the boats arrived to transport them to steamers and warships. The queue stood very still, no bunching, pushing, or shoving. Source 3, which is an eyewitnesses describing what happened, published in 1961, so 20 years later. Eyewitnesses reported some of the English soldiers got very drunk on the beaches. Some soldiers were very angry because they had been left by their officers. One officer shot another through the head because he tried to force his way onto an overloaded boat. This would have sunk the boat. Back in England, some angry soldiers just dumped their guns. And finally, source number 4, which was a BBC radio news bulletin on the 31st of May 1940. All day, men of the undefeated British Expeditionary Force have been coming home. The men have come back in glory, their morale is high, they are anxious to be back again, to have a real crack at the Germans. Okay, so stick the video on pause here, go to your table. For each source, what can you learn about Dunkirk? And does each source show that Dunkirk was a triumph, or does the source show that Dunkirk was a disaster? Okay, stick the video on pause, complete the table for these 4 sources, and then we'll be ready to move on. Well done, guys. By this point, we should have in our tables 4 sources. We should have taken information from those 4 and decided whether each 4 of those either decided Dunkirk was a triumph or a failure. Okay, if you've done that, we'll now move on to these next 3. Okay, source 5 was written in 1962 by a soldier who fought at Dunkirk. He was there on the day. The evacuation has been over-glamorized. I walked along the beaches several times and never saw a dead body. There was very little bombing. Some soldiers didn't want to fight, so they boarded a boat while the rest of their battalion was still fighting. Source number 6 is an extract from an English book that was published in July 1940. At Dunkirk, a miracle was born. Britain is full of heroes. When the word went around that the soldiers needed rescuing, there was not a man or boy who knew how to sail a boat. He was not prepared to give up his life to save a brave stranger. And finally, source number 7 there is a photograph of soldiers queuing on the beaches. Okay, so what information can we learn about Dunkirk from this? Put that in our tables, and then do we think each source describes Dunkirk as either a success or a failure? Okay, so again, I'd like to pop the video on pause for now and fill those 3 sources into your table. What information can you learn? Is it a triumph or a failure according to this source? Okay, pause the video now before moving on to the final few sources. Final source then, guys, is source number 8. This source is a series of statistics about Dunkirk. I'll read them out for you and read them together with you, and then you can go away back to your table, take the information that you can learn, and decide whether you think Dunkirk was a success or a failure, or a triumph or a disaster. Okay, British casualties: over 68,000 men were killed, captured, wounded, or missing. Equipment lost: 2,500 anti-aircraft and field guns, 11,000 machine guns, 75,000 vehicles, including tanks. Total number of troops evacuated was 338,226. Troops evacuated by civilians, so that's not army crafts, 26,500. Okay, so use this source. What can we learn about Dunkirk from this source? Does this show Dunkirk or the events of Dunkirk as a triumph or a disaster? Okay, so this is the last source. I'd like to fill in your table for this one as well, and then we'll move on to the final task of the lesson. Well done so far, guys. By now you should have completed your source table, taking information from each source and deciding whether it shows that Dunkirk was a success or a failure, or a triumph or a disaster. Okay, now it's your time or your chance to show me what you think. Okay, I've put a statement up there on the screen that says Dunkirk was a triumph. Okay, now I want you to decide in the 6 lines. I want you to decide, do you agree with this? So you can agree or disagree and explain your reason why. Okay, so do you agree with my statement? Write 6 lines either agreeing that Dunkirk was a triumph, or write 6 lines disagreeing that Dunkirk was a disaster. Okay, so 6 lines. Once you've written that paragraph, you can you've now finished the lesson, and you can upload your work, show my homework, which one of us teachers will go through and give you feedback on. Okay, so last thing, write this paragraph, then you're done. and you can upload to show my homework. Thanks guys for coming to the lesson, and I'll see you next week for next week's recorded session.